Today, I'm going to talk about using existing curricular competency frameworks to customize curricular design. And I'm not here to sell you a particular framework. What I hope I will do is, like we have an approach to clinical reasoning and clinical decision making, what I hope to do is walk you through some questions you should ask yourself when you think about developing a competency framework and adapting it to your own situation. Just a little bit of background. I was the chair of clerkship, which meant that I was responsible for everything that happened in our clinical training and our medical school for the better part of 6 years until July of this year. I have since taken over as the assistant secretary to the Committee on Accreditation of Canadian Medical Schools. So if I start talking about accreditation a little bit and why these concepts are important in the framework of accreditation, I hope you will understand. I don't really have any disclosures other than that to make. And the objectives today are to discuss competency frameworks in the context of accreditation and program quality assurance in undergraduate education. I'm not going to touch so much on competency frameworks for postgraduate. Provide you some examples and discuss some approaches that you might think about. First, I want to make sure that we're all using the same definitions. And to this, of course, we have to thank the Dutch and the Canadians. So first of all, competency is an observable ability. It can be measured and it can be assessed. A competence, on the other hand, is those array of abilities, knowledge, skills, and attitudes. The really important thing I want to bring out here is that competence is both multidimensional and it is dynamic. So the competence of an entering medical student, the competence of a student midway through the program, the competence of the student when they're granted their medical degree, the competence of someone at the end of their first year of postgraduate education will be different, and it will change along that longitudinal timeline. Learning objectives, I think it's very important to think about these that are specific, written in behavioral terms, and they have actions that are both observable and measurable. They identify the knowledge, skills, or attitudes, and they help us to inform our assessment strategy. So a simple example can be demonstrate an assessment of vital signs is a very broad, overarching objective. I'm going to talk a little bit as well about milestones. And milestones, the way that I think it's the clearest to think about them, are the outcome of an objective. So milestones specify the level to which the learner is expected to achieve that particular objective. It's a behavioral descriptor, and I'm not going to talk to you today about all the different scales that you can use, but I'll just stick to sort of the original one, which is this person at this time entrustable or pre-entrustable? And so, for example, the student might be asked to demonstrate how to obtain vital signs, and you want to see that they can actually obtain an accurate blood pressure measurement by, say, your national standard of how to do that. I'm then going to finish, I think this is my last definition, entrustable professional activity. So these are units of professional practice as tasks or responsibilities that the learner must do unsupervised once they've attained that competence. So again, coming back to those definitions a little bit. They're independently executable, observable, measurable. So talking about those mini CEX observations, right? Those stack up of observations that happen over time, until you become finally convinced that this learner has now achieved this entrustable professional activity and has had multiple demonstrations in multiple different settings showing that they can do that. So said another way, what are the key things that a student is expected to do upon finishing medical school training in order to succeed at the next step? And we had a very nice introduction to the thinking that a specific university goes through that ahead of this. So I'm going to put all of these things together in a little picture taken from the AAMC. So if you start on the left-hand side there and you think about your EPA, or what do you want your students to be able to do when they graduate, at the time of graduation? If you take that one EPA, you then want to link those on the right-hand side to the domains of competence that link into that EPA. You can further break down each of those domains of competence into individual competencies. You can measure the achievement of those by the milestones. And so in between the milestones and the individual competencies are your learning objectives. So I think to summarize that, the purpose of a competency-based framework is to ensure that your curriculum clearly links objectives and outcomes together, that it's organized and structured, that it can be scaffolded across the key domains that you identify, those big competency domains, that they're linked to learner assessment strategies, and that they're linked also to how the program evaluates itself, that you can use this to then identify gaps and redundancies in your curriculum and make sure that you're not either over or underrepresenting certain areas over time. And you can also ensure that you have ongoing review about how each part of that curriculum leads to those desired outcomes and to that desired graduate, as we heard about a little bit earlier. So all of these things are actually directly related to accreditation standards regarding curriculum. And I know that all of us, no matter where we are, have to meet those accreditation standards. I'm going to take the framework today offered by the World Federation of Medical Education, because again, I suspect that all of us are not only accredited by our national bodies, by the WIFME. And all of us strive to make sure that we can achieve that. So the WIFME defines curriculum in a detailed way, but I'm just going to bring out the 4 perspectives that I think are important for why we have a curriculum. One is for the learner. So again, just before me, we heard how important it is for students to understand what they're learning and why at each point in time, and how it can be extremely difficult actually to communicate that to them and know that they know that. It's for the teacher, so that you know as a clinical teacher what content you're delivering and how do you support the learners in their journey because you understand and know their curriculum. It's for the institution, so that the institution can set its assessment strategy and can set its strategy of program evaluation. And it's for society, because ultimately that's our most important stakeholder, is that society needs to understand what kind of doctors we're producing. And that is a never-ending thing. And anyone who sits in any chair who is tasked with any form of curriculum implementation in their school knows that they are constantly bombarded with emails asking for curriculum on this, curriculum of that, why isn't this represented more? It is constant. And so ultimately, though, having that big picture view helps you to find that balance. There are 3 particular standards that relate to the part of curriculum that relates to curricular frameworks that I want to talk about. The first is 2.1. So the school has identified the learning outcomes that the students should have achieved by graduation. So coming back to, one way to frame that is, what are the entrustable professional activities that your students must have achieved by the end of graduation? Those need to be described in terms of knowledge, skills, behaviors / attitudes. How do those map to your national regulatory standards? The second one is curriculum organization and structure. You have to document an overall organization of your curriculum. And the third is curriculum content. And I think it's so important here that the WIFME defines this in a way that this can vary according to school, country, context, resources, etc. There's no one singular way to do this. But there's 3 principal domains and 2 they add on that I think most of us have embedded within our curricula. So basic biomedical sciences, clinical sciences and skills, behavioral and social sciences, health system science, and humanities and arts. So why choose a competency-based framework? I hope I will sell you on this idea today. So first of all, I think it's because it focuses on the achievement of objectives as the main determinant for progress. Your other option is that everything is time-based or course-based. And I'll continue to try to make you see why I think medical education in 2022, no matter what the setting, it's, I think, time that we really become outcomes focused. So if we work backwards from the desired outcome, to ensure our curriculum matches the learning opportunities and assessment strategies required for the achievement of that outcome, rather than defining a whole bunch of pieces of curriculum and trying to determine where they lead to, I think makes a lot of intuitive sense when you start to do it that way. It allows for direct linkage of those outcomes that you want at graduation or the EPAs required to move to the next phase of training. And I think what we've really learned in the last couple of years is that it allows for flexibility in response to unforeseen circumstances. So from learner factors, I know myself leading the clerkship since the beginning of the pandemic and before that, so many learners off with illness. We've also had many learners in our school with functional limitations due to disability. If we had solely a time-based and a course-based framework, those students actually get punished in big, big ways. And the reason for that is because we don't look at what they've achieved and we don't look at what the expected outcomes are, because there are some learners who can achieve these outcomes in a shorter period of time or in a non-traditional course structure. And sometimes their circumstances dictate that that needs to be the case. Also, things happen, like pandemics, that are very disruptive to the medical school learning environment, especially clinical learning. In our case, on March 17th, 2020, our students were completely removed from the clinical environment and did not go back until July 1st. We had to still ensure that all our students graduated on time and met all of the objectives and EPAs and outcomes that we expected of our program on time. So we literally had 2 weeks to rejig our clerkship curriculum. I say we, I really mean me, with the help of some really good friends. But it was very difficult. And if we had had a curriculum that was based totally on time and on course structure, I honestly do not know how we would have done that. But because we focused on outcomes, we could rejig it to make sure that the outcomes were achieved, but the way of getting there was different. The other part that allowed us to do that is we have 3 different campuses. So for example, when our students do a pediatrics rotation, it may be in an academic center that is completely within a clinical teaching unit for their clerkship rotation. Those learners will achieve the same objectives and the same endpoint as our learners who are assigned to a very rural part of Southern Ontario with a singular pediatrician in a rural clinic. So again, it's not a course-based situation. It's very much an outcomes-based situation where we provide learners with all sorts of ways, experiential learning included, and some other learning formats. You heard today about things like podcasts, learning clinical reasoning through online case-based learning. We have all of those opportunities so that our students can sort of mix and match and end up at the same objectives at the end of the day. So knowing we could do that, and we've done that for many, many years, we knew in the face of the pandemic that we could rejig things and make sure our students achieve the same outcomes. So the competencies don't change at the end of the day, no matter what these circumstances are that you're talking about. What can change is the time, place, and experiences for the learner to achieve them. And I think that that's really important because it builds in that flexibility within your system. And then you can be assured that your graduates are all at the same place. So an optimal competency framework will be adaptable. This is another really key point, is I think you want to choose a framework that has relatively equal weighting of your curriculum across the identified domains. And some of these frameworks may not for your circumstance. And that sends a message to students that some things are more important or less important than other things. You want to make sure that there's equal weighting across domains appropriate for the stage of training, which does change. There's much more of an emphasis on health systems and basic science in undergraduate medical training compared to in postgraduate medical training, for example. It needs to be accessible to students, course planners, teachers, and stakeholders. Now, that's not so much going to allow you to choose one framework or the other, but it is very important in how you manage the framework. And it needs to be pragmatic. There needs to be a very clear link between the curricular area, the objective, the outcome, and a clear link between the outcome and the assessment method so that the teacher and the learner are both on the same page. The challenges: when a framework is developed to span the transition from the MD degree to practice, is it balanced and broad enough? Can the framework adapt to ongoing iterative changes in your curriculum so that you don't have to rewrite your framework every time you change a piece of your curriculum? In other words, is it focused enough on outcomes so that the process to achieve those outcomes can be altered over time? So examples are, we've heard a little bit about CanMeds. I do want to say one thing here, and that CanMEDS actually stands for the Canadian Medical Education Direction for Specialists, which is what it was developed as. It was developed for postgraduate education initially. It was then adapted into CanMEDS Family Medicine, which added 4 other domains. Those are the skilled clinician, resource in a defined population, community-based, and patient-physician relationship. There is also the physician competency reference set, which was developed explicitly for undergraduate education. It describes the CanMEDS domains in slightly different language and has 8 domains of competency with 8 domains of competence with multiple competencies in each, and was designed to be a flexible framework to be adapted into many different situations. CanMEDS has also been adapted into many different situations. I'm going to skip over that. A really nice example of an adaptation of CanMEDS nationwide is in Switzerland through the Profiles program. I don't know if anybody here is Swiss, but I was very impressed by this. So they took a combined approach using CanMEDS as a base and integrating the Swiss catalog of learning objectives. They also included a program of assessment right from the level of the supervisor or those formative workplace, very informal day-to-day assessments, leading all the way up to progress as determined by a committee. So that's summative and aggregative performance. Mapping of both planned and experiential curriculum, linking learning content and activities up to goals and to the assessment strategy. This is a very busy slide. I hope you will have reference to it somewhere. At McMaster, we went a little against the grain. I was involved in the committee that made this choice. We actually adopted PCRS and not CanMEDS. The reason we did so was we did not have equal weighting of our curriculum in CanMEDS. We had way, way, way too much that fell under medical expert because there was really no place to hang all of that basic science and health systems curriculum other than under medical expert. Whereas PCRS allowed us to spread our curriculum across the 8 different areas of competence more evenly, and it allowed us to modify it into our own circumstances. We included a preamble that was very explicit by saying that all competence areas were equally as important, that it implied that students would have appropriate supervision up until the point that they had achieved that entrustability, and that diversity of people's healthcare systems environments with an explicit focus on our Indigenous peoples was important in every single part of our framework and in every single objective. We also explicitly stated that we were not going to sort of hang the framework to a specific competency framework. We adapted pieces of everything and many, many things that were available to us. We also stated that curriculum leaders and planners within each course then had a duty to take that framework and take their curriculum and figure out how it spread into that and use that to identify their gaps and redundancies and move forward with that. And even though we initially developed this framework in around 2014, it is still an evolution as far as how our curriculum planners then map their own curriculum and assessments into this framework. We are constantly doing this through our curriculum committee and through our curriculum subcommittees. So we map all our competencies to course-specific objectives, learning opportunities, and assessments, and we have a searchable database. And if anyone's curious to look at it, it's freely accessible at cdb.medportal.ca, and you can use it to build all sorts of different grids and ways of looking at things from different perspectives in the curriculum. And the database is also key because just as it might be interesting for someone from another school to take a look, it's really important for our teachers and students to be able to take a look when they're in a certain area of the program, or they want to see, for example, all the different places in the program they might work on a specific area. They will be able to see that through using that database. So final considerations are think about your context, your country, your school mission statement, your resources, your national standards. Utilize the experience of those who've gone before you. Think about how the existing frameworks map to each other, because I think this is very important. They all do. I think that there is no one perfect framework. They all have challenges. Some will fit better in some contexts than others. Examine how they might map to your main curriculum components and objectives. Where do you see the gaps and redundancies? Do you expect a relatively equal balance of your curriculum? How modifiable is each framework to your curriculum? Also, how necessary is it to have a common language in your context? Sometimes there are national standards that are being set out, and so you have to work within those. Sometimes there are not. I can tell you that all 17 medical schools in Canada have all done this slightly differently. Ensure you have a database management system and use that as a starting point, because I think that part of this whole process is coming back to who needs to access your curriculum and who is it used by and what is it used for. And unless you have a way to do that, it will just exist on the pieces of paper that it exists on, or the digital pieces of paper, which is not very useful. But if you undergo this process and build the database at the same time, it can be incredibly powerful as you try to communicate this to your students and help your students have those linkages and purposes, not just from where they are, but where they're going next. And I love that cartoon. It's exactly true. And that's all I have to say today. So thank you very much. I've left a couple of references throughout the presentation and at the very end for those of you who have access to it online. So.
Thank you very much. Everyone will have an access to the whole lecture online, so hopefully that will serve part of the time requirements issues. The question I have is, there is some benefit to diversity, but there are also dangers. Where do you think we should put the border between those?
That's a really difficult question.
Sorry.
I do think we should be setting a minimum national standard. Again, you can't take my accreditation hat off. We should be setting a minimum national standard for what our students achieve. What are the outcomes? What kind of students do we want to see? And to me, that's in setting, probably around somewhere between 12 and 15 entrustable professional activities that you need to achieve by the end of medical school. I also think that each school should be allowed to add to that. The system should not be so rigid that each school can't focus on a specific area or tailor that towards the type of physicians that school is producing for the communities that they serve.
Well, thank you.